What's up guys, Dr. Shepherd here, and I am answering some of your questions today about the relationship between our guts and our brains. Or as a psychiatrist like to call it, our brains and our second brains. Why do we call it that, you ask? Great question. You're gonna have to watch this video to find out. Okay, so this is a super interesting topic, and it's also incredibly complicated and dense. And so just let me know if it's something you want to learn more about. I think what I'm gonna do is try to sort of simplify it, give you an overall big picture. And in this first video, we'll talk a lot about what the connection between the gut and the brain look like, what we think that's mediated by, and why we think that might be the case. And then in future videos, if we want to talk about any more subjects in particular, we can make this a whole series. There are entire careers built on this subject, and probably a decent number of them. So there is no shortage of material to talk about, and it's super interesting. And like I said, just let me know if you want to hear more. All right, so the overarching question that you guys basically had for me was, I didn't realize the gut and the brain work together. Dr. Shepherd, are you serious? And the answer is yes, I'm so serious. So the gut and the brain totally work together, and we really have to understand a little bit more about how that happens and why that happens in order to understand the impact that our gut health or, various diseases that we might have that affect the GI system might interact with our mental health and various diseases that we might have in our brains. As with most things in medicine, you can imagine that the gut-brain interaction is incredibly complicated. So it's this amalgam of factors that come together to kind of orchestrate this very complicated dance. And that dance involves roles from the immune system, from the nervous system. So specifically, the vagus nerve is involved in mediating a lot of these interactions, but other aspects of the nervous system are as well. It involves the endocrine system, so the system that regulates our hormones and how they interact with each other and how they stimulate different responses in our body. You might have heard of the HPA axis or the hypothalamic pituitary axis. So this axis is a big part of the endocrine system, a big part of our stress response and our immune system response, and the gut interacts with that as well. And then a whole nother subject that we can talk about more in future videos if you want is the gut microbiome. So this is a fascinating topic that's studied in a bunch of different illnesses. And basically it's the idea that these bacteria that chill with us all the time can kind of play a role in how we function and how our minds work, how our guts work. It's crazy, but you actually have more bacterial cells in your body than human cells. So you're basically like a large mush thing of bacteria. So you can use that as an insult next time you're mad at somebody, and you can't get in trouble for it because it's true. Sir, that was so rude. You are such a clump of bacteria. Okay, so let's dive into this a little bit more. And I'm gonna try to kind of skim the surface of a bunch of these different topics, and then we can talk more about them later if you guys want. So first, let's talk about the immune system. So the gut and the brain are intimately connected in a number of different ways. And one major way that they are connected is likely through our immune system. And there seems to be a decent amount of evidence for this. So how does that happen? Well, there again are a couple of different potential mechanisms, and it's all very complex, but the issue of gut permeability may play a role. So usually the gut is a closed system. So we put something in our mouth and we don't see it again until it comes out of our bum. Why did I just say that? Our anus, or collectively ani, anuses. Never thought about that. Our anuses. Yeah, it must be anuses. I kind of like ani better though. Anyways, so the gut is essentially a closed system, meaning that the bacteria that are within the gut don't usually go outside of the gut. And when they do, that tends to cause us some problems. And an example of this that I can recall from my clinical work is patients with factitious disorder. The other name for factitious disorder is Munchausen syndrome. That's sort of an old name for it, but one you might have heard. In patients with factitious disorder, I have seen people who have taken fecal matter and actually injected it into their bloodstream. And they do this in order to make themselves sick. So they assume the sick role, and that's part of the pathology of factitious disorder, is it's someone who wants to be in the sick role, and so they will do things to make themselves appear sick or actually get sick. So I've seen a couple of these patients who actually inject fecal matter into their bloodstream, and this, as you can imagine, doesn't go well. It's pretty bad. So people get very sick from it. It can cause major problems, and it's fecal matter, right? So it was already inside your body, but it was in this closed gut system. And it's when we take that bacteria out of that closed gut system that we run into problems. The reason that this is a closed system is because our cells kind of stick tightly together. If and when they start to pull apart, that can increase the permeability. So you don't have that nice fenced in barrier that makes the gut a closed system. So some things that can cause the cells in our gut to sort of separate and increase the permeability of the gut are things like stress. That's a major one. Illness, inflammation. Things like celiac disease, for example, is associated with a lot of inflammation in the gut. And so we know that there is increased permeability of the gut in that condition. And this increased permeability, you'll also hear termed as leaky gut if it gets bad. So as a side note, there is something that alternative medicine practitioners and naturopathic practitioners and some nutritionists promote called the leaky gut syndrome, that they purport is the cause of a lot of different, sort of this wide variety of different medical issues and different problems in your life. And there's really not any solid evidence that that is the case. Certainly there are certain diets and supplements that can help people with certain conditions, but kind of as a catch-all cure for everything doesn't really seem to work. And you'll see a lot of these people pushing really expensive supplements or nutritional programs or whatever and trying to kind of sell you on this diet thing. So don't fall for that. There's simply not enough evidence to suggest that gut permeability is like the holy grail and underlies all of these physical and mental illnesses, and that changing your diet can be the simple way to cure everything. That being said, there is evidence that gut permeability can cause problems. So the main way that this causes problems is, like I said, so the cells in the gut become more permeable, and this allows bacteria that are normally only in the gut to transfer into the bloodstream. This is a problem because bacteria in the gut, like the gram-negative bacteria E. coli, include things called endotoxins on their envelopes. Endotoxins, or lipopolysaccharides, are things that can trigger a pretty significant immune reaction. So they can cause us to secrete these things called cytokines or inflammatory markers that are essential to mount an immune response and get rid of that bacteria. So it's possible that the stimulation of this inflammatory reaction is something that could maybe underlie a portion of these mental illnesses. We know that major depressive disorder and other psychiatric disorders are associated with increased levels of these same inflammatory markers. So that's a really fancy way of saying that inflammation is associated with both problems with gut permeability and also certain mental illnesses like major depression. Now, we have seen in some animal studies that changes in the gut permeability and also fixing some of the changes in gut permeability in these animals can actually help reduce some psychiatric symptoms. All right, so that's a lot on gut permeability. The summary is that we really don't know how much of a role gut permeability plays in the development of mental illness, but we know that there's a plausible association between the two, but it's probably not good if bacteria are coming out of your gut and stimulating an immune response that can really irritate your brain. Again, be careful because the correlation is certainly there, but causation has not yet been proved. So if we can't prove for sure that gut permeability is the cause of mental disorders, Don't fall for people that are trying to sell you really expensive products and tell you that if you just fix your leaky gut syndrome, all your problems will disappear. If we do find out that leaky gut syndrome is something that we can fix and all our problems will disappear, then I will be the first to let you know. So another way that the gut and the brain are probably related is because the gut is a massive production source for many of these neurotransmitters that are super important in regulating our mood and emotion and behavior and all of that good stuff, even our cognition, our thinking skills, everything. So part of that is because you get a lot of serotonin from the molecule tryptophan, which is found in our diets. Similarly, we get a lot of dopamine from the gut as well, and we get that transformed from something called tyrosine, which is another molecule that's found in our food. So the gut is an essential source for manufacturing these neurotransmitters from things that we eat. So it's super interesting, but it's difficult to say how exactly the gut's production of these hormones ties into our mental state and our general mental health. But lots of people investigating that and lots of interesting hypotheses. All right, so another way that our guts and brains are connected is through, again, these microbiotas. So these little bacteria dudes that chill in our GI tract, they actually produce different byproducts. So when you feed yourself, you're also feeding your bacteria dude friends, and they go on to use that food to create byproducts. These byproducts include things that we call short chain fatty acids. And for my biochem nerds, you guys already know short chain fatty acids are just those with less than 6 carbons. So we're talking things like acetic acid, butyric acid, propionic acid, and others. So these short chain fatty acids are then absorbed into the bloodstream after they're produced by your bacteria dudes, and they go on to play a bunch of different complex and vital roles in your body. And there is evidence that these short chain fatty acids impact the function of the central nervous system. So of course we can think from that, well, if it's impacting our brain, then it might be impacting our mood and our behavior and our overall risk for mental health disorders. So it's interesting, the short chain fatty acids that are produced by your bacteria dudes are sometimes good, sometimes bad. There are some studies that have been done, for example, one in 2007. Again, these are animal studies because it's much easier to study in animals than in humans, so that's where a lot of the data is at this point. But in 2007, researchers injected propionic acid, remember one of the short chain fatty acids that I mentioned, into rats and showed that this resulted in increased levels of oxidative stress in these animals. So oxidative stress is basically stress on your cells. So it's when free radicals get released and they cause a bunch of problems in cells. They go around like beating the cells up and doing mean things to them. How did I make it through medical school? With the propionic acid injection and the higher oxidative stress levels, these rats also showed some issues like hyperactivity and repetitive behaviors. So this study was something that was used as a jumping off point to looking into whether the gut microbiome was playing a role in the development of autism spectrum disorders, because autism spectrum disorders are characterized in part, in some people, by hyperactivity and repetitive behaviors. This has been the subject of very intense research and debate. There's no clear conclusion at this point, but it is very interesting to note. And again, part of this is because there are all these animal studies, but we really have a hard time doing this stuff in humans. But it's something that is definitely being looked into for people with autism spectrum disorder, and more to come on that. Okay, so last major mechanism of gut-brain interaction that I want to talk about in this video is the vagus nerve. So Vegas, you think Las Vegas, and it's not actually that fun, but it's pretty close. So with the vagus nerve, it's actually a really important part of the parasympathetic nervous system. It's actually kind of the major player in the parasympathetic nervous system. And the parasympathetic nervous system is our rest and digest nervous system. So it's our nervous system that tells us to chill the F out when we're revved up. So it's basically something that tells you it's time to relax or it's time to digest your food. Like, you don't need to be running away from bears. You don't need to be hopped up. Just chill, hang out, do your thing. So when I said rest and digest, you guys probably picked up that digest was an important part of that. So the vagus nerve obviously plays a huge role in digestion. So what does the vagus nerve have to do with your mental health. So we've also found that the vagus nerve is associated with mental health issues. Higher vagal tone is actually better. So I think of tone in this instance as being sort of like power. So you want your vagus nerve to be more powerful. And to be able to kind of slow down your sympathetic nervous system response more easily. So people with higher vagus tone actually have less risk of anxiety and depressive disorders, while people with overall lower vagus tone have a higher risk of those disorders. Doing things that we know improve your mental health, like mindfulness training, meditation, breathing exercises, different relaxation techniques, these are all things that have also been shown to improve your vagal tone and decrease the risk of various mental health disorders. We also have something called vagus nerve stimulation that we use pretty rarely in psychiatry, but it is used. And vagal nerve stimulation is basically the implantation of an electrode to stimulate your vagus nerve and increase its tone. And we use this in people who have usually treatment refractory anxiety, depression, PTSD. The jury is still out on some of the efficacy with vagal nerve stimulation. I personally have not been thrilled with the results in a lot of studies, and it's obviously one of the more invasive interventions that we use, so we want to know that it's going to be effective, but it's something that we do use sometimes, and we do see good results in some studies. Interestingly, vagus nerve stimulation is also something that is being looked at in people with inflammatory bowel diseases like Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. Okay, so that's a lot of info, and we can talk more about this stuff if you guys want, but it's probably clear to you by now that the gut and the brain are intricately linked, that we really haven't begun to actually scratch the surface of how these interactions happen, but we know that they're there. So then the action question is like, what do we do about it? If you are suffering from a mental illness, the question on your mind might be, well, then is my gut playing a role in my illness? And the answer is we don't know, but it's possible. There have been a couple of studies recently looking at the effect of dietary interventions on people with major depressive disorder. One that recently concluded was called the SMILE study. They always have a cute name, don't they? And that was published in 2018. This study looked at about 70 participants and randomized them to be either in a dietary intervention group where they learned about good dietary habits. And in this study and others, they're primarily encouraging people to seek out what we call a Mediterranean diet. So Mediterranean diet meaning focusing on getting more whole grains, more vegetables and fruits, more lean meat products like fish especially, good healthy fats, so like avocados, nuts, and then kind of limiting your simple carbohydrates, limiting sugary foods, refined foods, highly processed foods, kind of all the stuff we know we should be doing. The dietary intervention arm learned more about that, and then there was a control arm that just sort of had treatment as usual. And the results were really impressive. So impressive that some of us in the field were like, is this legit? Like, could this actually be possible? So one of the primary outcomes was reduction of something called the MADRS score, or MADRS score, which is a certain type of test that we use to look at depression. And over the course of about 12 weeks, the MADRS score dropped, and this was a significant improvement and a decent size improvement. I think even more amazingly, they looked at remission. So in remission, we're looking for how many people drop below a certain number, in this case 10, on the MADRS scale. So how many people, like, their symptoms improve to the point where we would no longer say they're in a major depressive episode. And in the dietary intervention group, about 30%, a little bit more than 30% of people actually improved enough to be called remission. Whereas in the treatment as usual group, only 8% improved enough to meet criteria for remission. That also, as you can imagine, was a significant finding. Obviously, anytime you have a study that looks so impressive, you need to have replication. So we need more studies looking at the same thing, but there have been a couple other studies looking at specifically the Mediterranean diet as a way to reduce depression. And it seems like it does in some people. And honestly, what I fall back to in a lot of these cases is this an intervention that could be potentially harmful to people? And we already know that the Mediterranean diet and other sort of similar diets where you kind of reduce your sugar load and your processed food load is pretty helpful for your cardiovascular health. So honestly, there's not much downside to doing something like this. All that to say, if you are someone who has a mental health condition, I think it makes perfect sense to work on your dietary choices. And if you are able to do so, find little ways that you can kind of improve your dietary habits. If you watch my other videos, you know that making massive changes in habits probably not going to be all that helpful, because we tend to revert back to a sort of lower energy state, which for me is eating a lot of Oreos. But we can go back to our tiny habits and start making these tiny changes to better improve our health physically and possibly mentally as well. So for example, you could make yourself eat a handful of almonds every day, or you could start incorporating more vegetables in, your dinner. But if there are little ways that you can kind of add these healthy habits into your diet, that is something that, like I said, probably isn't going to hurt and might actually help your mental health based on some of the studies that we've seen. Now, there is such thing as going too far with a healthy diet. Over the past several years, we've started to understand that there's something called orthorexia, which is basically having a healthy diet to the exclusion of everything else and really sort of limiting yourself to healthy foods to the point where it becomes a problem for your life or actually becomes unhealthy for you. As always, this is meant to be educational. This is not meant to replace your doctor's advice. And it's something that, if you're going to make a major change to your diet or your exercise habits, always a good idea to check with your physician first. Let me know in the comments if there's other stuff you guys want to talk about and if you want to make this into a series, and I will see you guys later.